In just a few minutes, Jasmine Crockett delivered an unscripted line that moved President Ibrahim Traoré to tears and sent tremors through Washington. She hadn't come to offer praise, she came to confront a hard truth that U.S. aid to Africa often comes with strings attached. Jasmine stared straight into the camera and cut through decades of Western hypocrisy. Africa doesn't need saving. It needs to be heard, she declared. What did she say that united millions? Angered powerful elites. And why is America still trying to suppress her words? Stay with us. This is a story worth every moment of your attention. In the heart of Ouagadougou. As the morning heat shimmered across the palace courtyard, President Ibrahim Traoré paced inside his study like a man facing too many battles and running out of time. His cotton tunic clung to him, damp from a sleepless night spent unraveling yet another foreign policy trap disguised as generosity. On his desk lay a red folder marked urgent. Inside, a brief note from the Foreign Ministry, a video call set for 10:30 a.m. with U.S. Representative Jasmine Crockett. No explanation, no context, just a name. He frowned, not because he feared the conversation, but because he recognized the tactic. A black congresswoman, likely chosen to soften the message, give the illusion of equality while pushing the same old demands under more polite packaging. Another face, he muttered. Another mask for the same game. His chief advisor, Minister, coolably entered without knocking, tablet in hand, eyebrows already raised. Sir, it's a soft call, he said while scrolling. Labeled under agricultural cooperation. Nothing strategic, just optics. Traoré gave him a look cold enough to freeze lava. Optics, he repeated. That's what colonialism wears in the 21st century in meetings, in memos, and smiles. He shut the folder with a snap, set the camera in the study. No media, no briefing, I'll speak to her alone. Coolably hesitated, he knew that tone. It was the one Traoré used just before doing something that made Washington and Paris lose. Sleep. Very well, he said, stepping out, but not before casting one last glance at the folder. The name lingered in his mind like a spark waiting for fire. Jasmine Crockett, across the ocean in Washington. The sky hung gray and heavy, as if the city itself sensed something coming, inside a small, makeshift studio just a few blocks from the Capitol. Jasmine Crockett sat alone at a folding table. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched beside her. A single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across the walls. Her team had already cleared the room, giving her privacy, but the silence was louder than applause. Just 2 days earlier, she had been publicly torn apart by national media for criticizing conditional U.S. aid to Africa. The headline stung. Crockett undermines U.S. interests. Congresswoman defends authoritarian regimes. Is this who represents us? And it wasn't just the press. Allies went silent. Colleagues whispered in the halls. Donors stopped returning her calls, yet here she was, just minutes from speaking directly to the president of a country at the heart of the storm. She stared at the printed remarks before her, each line carefully written, approved and soaked in neutral phrasing. Economic collaboration, agricultural development. Strategic dialogue. It was diplomatic sedative designed to please everyone and say nothing. Jasmine's jaw tightened. Her fingers hovered over the pages, then slowly pushed them aside. I'm not here to lie for comfort, she whispered to herself. I'm not here to protect systems that never protected me. She stood, straightened her blazer, and caught her reflection in the black screen of the monitor. Behind her eyes burned the rage of 1,000 dismissals, 1,000 moments when being right wasn't enough because she wasn't white, wasn't safe, wasn't silent. The world expected her to back down. Instead, she was about to ignite a fire she hadn't come to calm egos. She came to make people listen, really listen, and once that screen came to life, there'd be no going back. The monitor blinked on with a soft chime, but the tension hit like a drum beat on one side of the call. President Traoré sat at an old, wooden desk. Sunlight poured through tall windows, casting long shadows. His expression remained unreadable, the face of a man used to being watched. Rarely caught off guard, behind him, aides stood quietly. One held a folder of policy notes. Another adjusted the translator's headset. The protocol officer gave a subtle nod. The call was officially underway. On the screen, Jasmine Crockett appeared. She sat in a plain room against a dusty blue backdrop. The overhead light softened her features. She didn't look rehearsed. She looked ready, her hands were folded, but her eyes revealed something deeper, the quiet tension of someone who had been underestimated too often in many rooms just like this. A staff member broke the silence. "Congresswoman Crockett, the floor is yours." Jasmine gave a polite nod, not warm but respectful. She reached for the stack of remarks in front of her. For a moment, it looked like she might read from the script. Her fingers touched the edge of the first page, then, calmly, almost gently, she slid the whole stack aside. The camera caught every movement. One of Traoré's aides stiffened. The translator paused, unsure if he had missed something, but Jasmine's face didn't flinch. She looked straight into the lens and began to speak. "Mr. President," she began, her voice low, firm, and so steady it commanded attention. "I was handed prepared remarks today, safe words, diplomatic language, the usual." She paused, just long enough to signal she had chosen a different path. "But I'm not going to ... Read those words closely, not because they were meant for you, but because they were crafted to keep things easy for the people back home." Her gaze didn't shift once. "I think you deserve better," she said, "and so do the people watching." The room on both ends of the screen froze. Not from confusion, but because something unexpected was happening. In the world of diplomacy, that's like setting off a flare in a minefield. The protocol officer lowered his pen. The translator cleared his throat, then stayed silent. Jasmine continued, not louder, but with more depth. "I know I was expected to talk about trade and aid today. But honestly, I think we've heard enough speeches that go nowhere. I came to speak directly. Person to person, leader to leader, no script, no filter." Her voice wasn't raised. She wasn't performing. But there was something powerful in her calm, steady delivery, something that made the room feel tighter. The conversation had shifted from formalities to something real, and just like that, the silence changed. It wasn't from confusion, it came from understanding. It was the kind of silence that follows a truth no one had dared say out loud, but everyone needed to hear. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands rested flat on the desk, her posture composed. But her eyes carried a quiet fire. She had practiced safe, diplomatic lines the night before, lines designed to be forgettable. Now, she had let them go. And in doing so, she found her freedom. She didn't need to raise her voice. The honesty in it made every word land. "Mr. President," she said, each word clear and deliberate, "there's something I need you to understand right from the beginning. I'm not here to fix anyone's image. I'm not here to promote the idea that America is doing Africa a favor." She leaned forward. The tension in her shoulders eased, not from comfort, but from the relief of finally speaking the truth. "I came to ask something my government won't say out loud, something simple, something overdue." Her eyes stayed locked. "Why is it that America always talks about helping you, but never pauses to ask what you want?" The words didn't just linger, they pressed down, heads turned. Aides exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to take notes or brace for impact. The translator hesitated, then slowly repeated her words. Careful, like handling fragile glass. One of Traoré's advisors shifted uncomfortably. The protocol officer stopped mid-note. Even the walls seemed to be listening. Jasmine continued, her voice firmer but fully in control. "We often speak of aid and partnership, but too often it's not true partnership. It's control disguised as generosity. We attach conditions. We dictate how it's spent, who you can work with, what to allow and what to deny. That's not support. That's control." Her jaw clenched briefly, and then we act surprised when trust between us is thin. Still, no one responded. The air felt electric. In one clear moment, she had cut through decades of polished rhetoric with truth. The effect wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. This was no longer a speech. Jasmine was holding the room to account. The silence stayed thick across the call. But she wasn't done, not even close. She inhaled deeply, as if drawing in decades of history, and began again, not with anger, but with unwavering resolve. "I didn't come into this meeting unprepared, Mr. President," she said, her tone calm but strong. I didn't just skim a briefing or memorize talking points to sound informed. I studied. Her hands opened slightly on the desk, as though she was placing something meaningful between them. I read about your people, your land, your struggles. Not out of obligation, but because I wanted to, because when I first saw your name in a headline, it wasn't in praise, it was mockery. They called you reckless, dangerous, a threat to stability. She scoffed quietly. But whose stability were they defending? She let that question sit in the air, then answered it herself. The more I read, the more I understood you were doing something rare. You were saying no. Her voice sharpened with intention. No to OMF loans wrapped in promises. No to the kind of aid that arrives with a smile and a contract full of restrictions. No to the idea that Africa should be grateful for things it never asked for. And you didn't say it with resentment. You said it with clarity, with purpose, with strength. She leaned in again, as if closing the distance between them. And then I found myself reading more about a man your people still speak of with both sorrow and pride, Thomas Sankara. Her voice lowered, now reverent. He didn't just talk about freedom, he lived it. He made his ministers drive used cars. He banned government perks. He planted trees while others signed corrupt deals. He once told the world, "We must dare to invent the future," and for that he was silenced. She paused for a breath. Not just with bullets, but by the fear he caused in those who gained from keeping Africa quiet. Her words slowed, but carried more weight than ever. When I saw you choose that same path, not perfectly, but with courage, I understood something deeper. I understood why people back home are quick to label you a radical. Why the media often ignores what you're building, but never misses a chance to highlight what you're refusing. She looked directly into the camera. Because you're not just pushing back on policies, you're pushing back on power. The kind that's grown too comfortable speaking without ever being challenged. She pressed her lips together, then spoke again, this time softer but just as firm. Back in Washington, I was warned just mentioning your name could send the wrong signal. They said, he's not an ally. But no one ever asked me what message I wanted to send. They assumed I'd fall in line, smile politely, shake hands, and uphold systems that have never protected people like me or like you. They warned me, Mr. President. But what they didn't realize is that I wasn't afraid of backlash. I was afraid of silence. She paused again. Heart steady though, her throat tightened with emotion. That's why I'm here, not to offer blind praise, not to play politics, but because when I saw you stand alone, I knew I had to stand too, on the other end of the call. The room remained still. No one wrote anything down. No side conversations. Even the translator's voice softened when repeating her words, as if he sensed this was no longer just dialogue, it was something closer to truth. The truth she spoke didn't echo. It landed like dust settling after the roar of a battlefield, but instead of stepping back, Jasmine leaned forward. This was her moment to break the silence. Mr. President, she said, her voice sharper now, almost defiant. You've done what too many of our leaders, my leaders, don't have the courage to do. She didn't flinch. You chose people over profit, dignity over dollars. You placed your citizens above comfort, career, and reputation. Her hand pressed firmly against the table now, fingers tight, and for that they call you unstable. For that, they tell us to keep our distance. She leaned in further, her voice rising steadily like a tide. But what if real instability is leadership that's too afraid to make the same choice? Across the screen, something shifted. Ibrahim Traoré, who had sat motionless, slowly leaned forward. It wasn't dramatic, but it showed he was no longer listening like a politician. He was hearing something he hadn't dared to hope for. His advisors glanced at each other, uncertain whether to step in. But he didn't wave them off. He didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Jasmine, focused, as if realizing, this isn't noise. This is new, and Jasmine saw it, that small change in his posture, the tiny crack in his guard, and she didn't hold back. She drew a breath, then delivered her next line like thunder striking steel. You reminded me what leadership should look like, and it's not about power. It's about sacrifice. And just when it seemed she had said the most daring thing on that call, Jasmine stopped. Not out of hesitation, but because the moment needed quiet. The kind of silence that makes room for truth. Her hands rested gently on the desk. A sheet of notes lay beneath her fingers, untouched for minutes. She didn't need them. She let the silence stretch, not to fill the space, but to make space. Space for something that couldn't be softened. Something that had to land with the full weight of history, injustice, and raw, unfiltered honesty. She inhaled once, held it, then let the words go like a blade drawn clean. Africa doesn't need saving, she said, voice clear and free of theatrics. Africa needs to be heard. The sentence didn't rise, it dropped like stone into still water, deep and undeniable. The translator blinked, visibly taken aback. He opened his mouth, paused, then looked to the protocol officer beside him. Even he seemed unsure whether to repeat it, not because it wasn't clear, but because it was too clear. Because it broke a script everyone else had silently agreed to follow. When he finally translated, his voice was slower, more careful, almost respectful, as if repeating something sacred he hadn't expected to hear. President Traoré sat still, but tension moved like a ripple beneath glass. Advisors glanced around, uneasy. One reached quietly for his tablet, likely imagining headlines. American Congresswoman defies protocol on diplomatic call. Another whispered to the communications chief. No one heard the words, but everyone felt them. This is going to blow up. This call wasn't supposed to go this way. It was meant to be routine, symbolic, safe. But the moment wouldn't stay safe. And then, in the stillness, the only movement came not from panic, but from the president himself. Slowly, Traoré's hands, once calm, curled into fists. Not with anger, but with something far more unsettling. To those in power, truth finding its mark, his jaw tightened. His shoulders pulled back. He didn't speak, didn't blink. But his eyes said it all. Tears began to gather. He blinked once, slowly, uncertainly. Then another tear rose behind it, not just from emotion, but from memory, from exhaustion. From years of fighting to be seen as more than a recipient, a subordinate, a footnote in someone else's story. And now, across an ocean, a single woman had said aloud what no ally, no donor, no diplomat ever had. You don't need to be saved. You need to be heard. And he heard it. A single tear slid down his cheek, tracing a silent path through the tough exterior of a man known for his strength and resistance. His chest rose with a breath deeper than any before. In front of his team, in front of the world, the president of Burkina Faso wept, not out of weakness, not out of shame, but from the deep, sacred sorrow of a man who had fought every day to prove his people's worth, and who finally had been told they mattered. No one moved. No one dared speak. It was as if the call had shifted from diplomacy to something sacred. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't try to fill the silence. She let it breathe, because she understood. This moment didn't need more words. This was the moment when the truth had finally landed. But silence, no matter how heavy, never lasts. As the final frame of the video call faded into black, Jasmine Crockett's composed resistance gave way to a storm of fury sweeping across the American political scene. It didn't take hours, just minutes. By the time Jasmine had stepped out of her office and let go of the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, the backlash had already begun. The first hit came straight from Capitol Hill. Senator Alan McKean, a veteran Republican with years of media training, appeared live on Fox News, staring directly into the camera. He declared coldly, "This Congresswoman chose to embarrass the United States before a barely legitimate strong man. That wasn't diplomacy, it was self-promotion dressed up as a TED Talk." The clip spread rapidly, chopped into 30-second bursts of outrage on Twitter. Pundits labeled her performance unprofessional, reckless, and even disgraceful. On AM radio, her name was mentioned more frequently than the president's. Commentators accused her of pushing Marxist narratives, calling her a symbol of woke foreign policy. One radio host sneered, "She sounds more like a spokesperson for Africa than a representative from Texas." And the wave didn't stop. Conservative memes flooded social media, her face edited beside authoritarian figures, her words distorted into slogans like "Jasmine for Burkina 2024." A well-known right-wing influencer dubbed her the Angela Davis of foreign betrayal. Within Congress, whispers grew louder. Reporters swarmed outside her office. Even some Democrats expressed quiet concern, unsure if she had overstepped. One aide told Politico anonymously, "You don't slap Washington while you're still sitting in it." Yet, as the criticism reached its peak, something unexpected began to happen, something powerful. Her words refused to disappear. In Nairobi, her speech aired in full unedited, translated into 3 languages. In Lagos, youth radio shows played her statement, "Africa doesn't need saving. It needs to be heard," layered over Afrobeat music, transforming it into a protest anthem. In Johannesburg, university students projected her image onto campus buildings, calling her the voice they'd long awaited. In Harlem, community leaders replayed her speech in churches and town halls. It echoed through South Central LA, Atlanta barbershops, and Baltimore high schools. This wasn't just going viral. It felt like truth finally reaching those who had waited far too long to hear it. And it wasn't limited to Africa, it resonated with every neighborhood that had been overlooked, every community that had been talked about but never truly addressed. Jasmine's inbox overflowed with messages from people she'd never met, students, teachers, mothers, immigrants, even inmates. All of them shared one sentiment: thank you for voicing what we've always felt but were never allowed to say. A single mother from Houston wrote, "You helped me believe again, not in politics but in dignity." The more the system tried to tear her down, the more human she appeared, not flawless, not rehearsed, but authentic. And somehow, that was more unsettling to the establishment than anything she had actually said, because Jasmine Crockett had done something rare. She stared power in the eye and said, "You're not the only voice that matters anymore." They wanted to silence her. Instead, they made her impossible to ignore, and while her words blazed through political institutions and public spaces, something quieter stirred across the Atlantic, something no press crew followed. No breaking news tracked, but it was just as powerful. President Ibrahim Traoré gave no notice to his cabinet. He didn't brief his press secretary. No public agenda was shared. Just a quiet word to his aide. "Take me to Tabaga, a remote village in southeastern Burkina Faso, known not for politics but for millet fields. Worn roads and people who saw dignity not as an ideal but as a way of life." He wore a simple tunic knot, a tailored suit, no medals or badges, and stepped into an old, sun-bleached Jeep with just a driver and one silent guard. As they left the capital behind, the formal world of protocol and press faded into red earth, warm winds, and the slow pull of memory. The ride was long and quiet. The air shimmered with heat. As the tires bumped along dry roads, Traoré sat in the back, one hand on the window frame, the other on his knee. His thoughts weren't on policy or the uproar in Washington. They were on the moment, her voice clear and unwavering had cut through the noise. "Africa doesn't need saving. It needs to be heard." Those words played in his mind over and over, like a truth too deep to ignore. When they finally reached the village, the Jeep rolled in quietly. There were no barricades, no celebrations, just stillness. Then, slowly, people began to stir, heads turned from doorways. Children paused their games. Elders rose from mats beneath baobab trees. No one had announced his visit, yet somehow they seemed to know. Maybe they felt it because in a land where history often arrives as silence or fire, people have learned to sense moments before they happen. He stepped down into the red dust, sandals landing softly. A small crowd gathered, not out of obligation but out of respect. The president stood alone, no entourage, no script. Just presence. And as he walked past the quiet faces, he nodded, not like a ruler, but like someone returning to something deeply important. From the crowd, a child stepped forward. He was young, maybe 7 or 8, barefoot, wearing a shirt far too big, and his eyes were steady and fearless. His name was Tano. In his hands, wrapped in a worn piece of cloth, he held a small wooden item. The corners peeked out just enough to show it had been carefully carved by hand. The crowd naturally parted. Sensing the weight of the moment without needing it explained, Tano walked slowly, purposefully, until he stood before Tro. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, one man carrying the burden of a nation, one child too young for politics but wise enough to recognize truth. Without a word, the boy extended the bundle. Tro knelt not out of formality, but out of something deeper. His knees touched the earth. He carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a sculpture carved from dark rosewood. Two figures, simple, stylized, one tall, one small. Their hands were joined tightly. The larger figure leaned down. The smaller reached up, as if the weight of the world was shared between them. At the base, etched clearly, were three words in French: Lancias uni lemon, kindness unites worlds. The president didn't speak at first. He ran his thumb along the sculpture's edges. The wood was uneven in places, smoother in others. It was clearly made by a child. Yet it carried a message, one not crafted by speechwriters or campaigns, not staged or polished. This was something raw and sincere. Then the tears came, catching even him off guard. They weren't political tears or signs of sorrow. They came from something older, deeper, a release after years, even decades, of carrying the weight of duty and resilience. His shoulders shook. His lips pressed together. He didn't wipe the tears. He let them fall slow, steady, like rain carving into stone. No one moved. The villagers stood frozen, eyes wide, hearts struck. They had seen their president speak with world leaders, walk through battle zones, stand firm through crisis, but they had never seen this side of him. Honest, vulnerable, human. Tano didn't flinch. He watched, not confused, but calm, as if, somehow, he understood that this moment wasn't about applause or power. It was about release. He took a step closer. The president, still kneeling, looked up. Tano reached out and gently touched his arm. "You made us feel heard." The boy whispered. Troe acute nodded slowly, trying to reply but unable to form words. He looked around the village, the cracked walls, the bare feet, the worn tools, but also the eyes. They shone, not with pity, but with pride. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré understood something Jasmine had always known. True power isn't about what you build. It's about who you see. Eventually he rose, still holding the sculpture. He said nothing, grand, no speech, no announcement. He simply turned to his aide and said quietly, "I want this on my desk, not the plaque. Not the flag. Let this remind me of what I'm truly carrying." And with that he walked back to the jeep, eyes red, pace slow, but with a heart lighter than it had been in years. That evening, as the sun set over Tambaga and villagers returned home, Tano sat under the baobab tree with his older sister. He didn't say much, just held the cloth that had wrapped the sculpture. His sister asked, "Do you think he liked it?" Tano didn't smile. He looked toward the road where dust still hung in the air and said, "I think he needed it." And miles away, as lights flickered on in the capital and the city resumed its rhythm, President Traoré sat alone in his private study. The sculpture now sat at the center of his desk. He didn't turn on the news. He didn't check his phone. He just sat back, staring at the two wooden figures, one large, one small, hand in hand. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself feel hope. Not as a leader, but as a man who had finally been heard. The lights in the studio were sharp and cold, not the kind that flatter, but the kind that reveal everything. The cameras were already rolling when Jasmine Crockett walked onto the set. She adjusted her microphone herself, no assistant. No frills, just her, a chair, and the quiet determination of someone stepping into the lion's den without blinking. Across the table sat the host, polished, rehearsed, every move calculated. He shuffled his cue cards like the show hadn't already begun. He wasn't there to listen. He was there to trap. As Jasmine took her seat, the lights dimmed slightly. A red light on the camera came on, like a flare. Congresswoman Crockett, the host, opened with a syrupy tone. "You've had quite the week, viral attention, global headlines, and plenty of criticism, especially from people in your own country. So let me ask what everyone's thinking. If you had the chance to go back, knowing the backlash your words would bring, would you still say them?" The atmosphere in the room grew tense. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't blink. She didn't soften her posture for the audience. Her words came slowly, not from hesitation, but with the care of a surgeon making a first incision. "Let me be clear," she said, locking eyes not with the host, but with the camera speaking directly to the millions watching from homes, phones and classrooms. "I didn't speak to get applause. I didn't speak to grab headlines. I spoke because silence is far too costly." The host shifted in his seat. The camera zoomed in. Jasmine's voice grew heavier, not louder, just weightier. "I didn't praise President Traoré because of his title. I praised him because in a world drowning in self-interest, he chose something rare: service. He stood up to the systems we all know are biased against nations like his. He gave children books instead of leaving them in debt. And that frightened people because it reminded them of what they're not doing." She paused, letting the silence stretch. Then her tone sharpened. "If my words made people uncomfortable, maybe the discomfort isn't about what I said. Maybe it's about the reflection those words force them to see. Maybe it's the question they've been avoiding: who are we really serving?" The host raised a hand to interrupt, but Jasmine kept going. "We send aid with conditions. We give with one hand and take with the other. We wrap it in words like partnership and stability, but it's really about control. And when someone, especially someone from a place like Burkina Faso, says, 'No, thank you,' suddenly they're labeled a threat, a tyrant, a danger to democracy." She shook her head, calm and focused. "I praised a man not for his position, but for his courage. And if that unsettles those in power, maybe that says more about their insecurity than my integrity." The air in the room crackled. The camera crew had stopped moving. Even the floor manager, usually busy with cue signals, stood still. Jasmine leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to draw the audience closer. "Our political world is so obsessed with appearance that we've forgotten how to recognize truth when it's said plainly. We laugh at sincerity, we punish honesty. And heaven forbid a black woman speaks boldly on a global stage. Suddenly it's called betrayal." Now, her eyes briefly met the host's. "You asked if I'd do it again," she said. "And the answer is yes. Every single time. Because telling the truth about dignity shouldn't put your career at risk. It should be the whole point." She exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but as if letting something go. "I won't apologize for acknowledging what's right. And if my country is more upset about me praising justice than about its failure to uphold it, then we have much bigger problems than one speech." The studio remained still. The host tried to smile, but it faltered. Jasmine didn't wait for another question. She folded her hands, voice steady and quiet but firm. "I've sat in rooms where I was tolerated but never welcomed. I've heard the whispers, too emotional, too passionate, too much, but I've realized it's not my words they fear. It's the chance that someone might believe them. That someone might hear me and say, 'If she can speak like that, maybe I can too.'" She paused. "Maybe that's the part that frightens them most." The segment cut to commercial, but the moment didn't fade. It was already being clipped, captioned, and shared across the internet. And Jasmine? She leaned back in her chair, unbothered by the rising storm. She hadn't just defended herself, she had sparked something. The sun rose high over Ouagadougou, casting a golden light over a plaza more crowded than it had ever been, not for a concert, not for a military parade, not even for a national holiday. This was something else. There were no choreographed performances, no brass bands, no motorcades. Just people, ordinary citizens standing still under worn umbrellas, behind temporary barriers, on rooftops. They came for one reason: to witness something they had never been promised. They weren't here for handouts. They weren't waiting for foreign delegates or thick envelopes of aid. They were waiting for recognition, for a sign that maybe this time real change could begin. From within, on a makeshift stage, stood a canvas-covered frame. Behind it, out of sight, a few technicians in black t-shirts worked with an old projector and tangled cords. The heat made the equipment temperamental. The screen showed faint stains. Then, after a crackle of static and the flicker of a loading bar, the screen lit up. A soft gasp swept through the crowd, like a ripple spreading across a pond. Her image appeared: Jasmine Crockett, towering 40 feet high, beamed from her congressional office in Washington. She looked both distant and familiar, like a long-lost relative calling out against the wind and somehow reaching distant shores. She wore no jewelry, no American flag pin, just a plain black blouse. Yet her posture and steady gaze spoke volumes. To the children of Burkina Faso, she said in a calm, intimate tone, to the teachers who show up day after day without chalk, to the mothers who trek 6 miles so their daughters can attend school, to the fathers who stay up late teaching their sons to read by candlelight, you are not invisible. The crowd remained silent, hanging on her every word. She went on. Too often, others write your story in boardrooms, in Western capitals, in newspapers that will never mention your names. They call you fragile, they call you poor. But when I met your president and studied your history, I saw not weakness, but strength, resilience, a defiance that refuses to be defined by outsiders. The hush deepened as Jasmine leaned forward and quietly shared. A little boy once gave me a sculpture, 2 figures holding hands, one large, one small. Carved beneath were 5 simple words. Kindness unites the world. She lifted the carving into view, the very gift Tano had presented to President Traoré weeks earlier. Her fingers trembled just a bit. That boy may not know the power of his gift, she said, but I carry it every day as a reminder that real power doesn't come from control. It comes from how deeply we care. The camera lingered on her eyes a moment longer before the video dimmed to black. The plaza stayed still, neither the girl clutching a borrowed notebook nor the elder with the bent cane moved. Then, softly at first, applause broke out. It swelled into a thunderous wave, children shouting her name, elders raising their hands, men beating their chests. Even those who didn't fully grasp her words had felt something profound. They had been seen. Stepping into the sunlight beside the screen was President Ibrahim Traoré. No teleprompter, no red carpet, no entourage, just a man in a hand-woven tunic, awe and disbelief carved into his features. He paused to let the crowd's cheers wash over him, then spoke in French, his voice thick with feeling. She did not bring promises or contracts. She did not treat us like students or speak down to us. His gaze swept the front row of children, settling on a girl in a purple headscarf perched on her father's shoulders. She did something far braver. She listened. Silence fell again, not from confusion, but from respect. Traoré continued, "You don't need pity or to be saved. You don't need more signatures on papers in languages you don't speak. You need to be heard." A gust of wind fluttered the flags behind him, tearing one at the edge, but no one looked away. She praised me not because I'm president, but because I chose service clinics before contracts, schools before speeches, dignity before dollars. Then, unguarded, he stepped off the stage and moved into the crowd. Gasps rose as he approached. The girl in purple knelt beside her, placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "One day you will lead too." She nodded, lips quivering. He rose, turned to the crowd, and declared, "This is not the end. It's the beginning." The plaza erupted once more, this time with belief, hundreds of miles away. In a dusty classroom where sunlight spilled through wooden slats, Ila sat at the end of a splintered bench. Her knees pressed together, she traced letters in her stiff, new notebook, her pencil worn thin. Today, she wasn't afraid to write her dream. "One day I will be a teacher like the president," she wrote, staring at the words as if they'd appeared by magic. A magic sparked weeks before when she saw his image on a poster near the village market. He walked among children, visited clinics, smiled like a father. Not a ruler. Next to the schoolyard, under a neem tree, little Nima sat cross-legged, rocking a ragged cloth doll. One eye was a button, the other a stitch of black thread. Reverently she whispered, "Her name is Hope." Before, I didn't know what to wish for. Now I do. The teacher, watching from the doorway, blinked back tears. She had seen many students, but never a moment like this, 2 girls speaking their futures into existence. Back in class, Ila raised her hand and, when called on, read her sentence aloud with a strength beyond her years. "When I grow up, I want to be a teacher like the president." Silence fell once more, not because it was odd, but because it felt inevitable. Her classmates clapped, some shyly, others with bright excitement, imagining their own dreams. The boy beside her asked, "Do you think boys can become presidents?" "Too," she smiled and answered without pause, "if they listen first." And just like that, the world shifted not by laws or speeches, but by a little girl in a forgotten village who believed she was seen and knew her voice mattered now. In this very moment, whispers of dreams and hope were the revolution in its simplest form. Politics hadn't arrived with fanfare or foreign consultants. It had arrived quietly, in the hands of children writing on paper. It was born in the imagination of a young girl who believed leadership wasn't about shouting, it was about truly listening. In rural villages, children whispered dreams they didn't even realize they were allowed to have. And slowly, hope began to spread through Burkina Faso like early morning mist. Far from that quiet hope, in a brightly lit studio in Washington, D.C., Jasmine Crockett prepared to speak her final truth. The red recording light came on. Across from her sat one of America's most recognizable political interviewers. Man more famous for cutting people off than drawing them out. He'd challenged presidents, embarrassed governors, and once pushed a senator to leave the set mid-show. Jasmine didn't flinch. She wore no designer blazer, no rehearsed grin. Just calm defiance and a kind of quiet fire, the kind that doesn't shout, but leaves a mark. Congresswoman Crockett, the host began, slowly as if setting a trap. If you could go back knowing the backlash, the global headlines, the harsh critiques, would you still say those same words to President Traoré? Jasmine didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. Then she leaned in, elbows resting on the table, locking eyes with the camera. Because I didn't praise him for being a president. I praised him for something even more rare, for putting his people above his power. The host blinked, momentarily thrown. The crew behind the cameras fell still. This wasn't a calculated political line, it was something uncheckable. And Jasmine kept going. In this town, she said, her voice tightening, we like to dress up silence as strategy. We call it professionalism when we avoid hard truths. But I won't apologize for saying that really listening to Africa is more revolutionary than all the aid we've ever sent her. She paused, letting it sink in. And if that makes some of my colleagues uncomfortable, maybe they should ask what their comfort is costing the rest of the world. The air felt charged, no scripted slogan, no pre-approved message. Just honesty, sharp, focused, and real. The segment aired without edits. Within an hour, it had been shared over 4 million times. By midnight, young activists were quoting her in videos. By morning, high school walls were covered in spray-painted words, "Power doesn't serve people. People serve people." Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, the presidential residence stood still beneath the rising sun. Inside, President Ibrahim Traoré moved deliberately, not for cameras. He wore no sash, no medals. Just a plain tunic. On a nearby table sat the sculpture Tano had gifted him, its surface smoothed from being held often. He looked at it again that morning, as if still trying to grasp how such small hands could carry such a powerful message, and in that quiet moment, with no audience and no press, he whispered not to others but to history, "We did it." He wasn't talking about politics. He meant something deeper, something more timeless. The moment a leader becomes more than a title, when they reflect their people's quietest hopes. In a village miles away, a school bell rang at a humble primary school built by local hands. And despite international doubt, children shuffled in with hand-me-down notebooks and third-generation uniforms. Among them sat a girl named Adama. She had never met the president. She didn't know who Jasmine Crockett was, but she sat at her desk like it was a throne when she opened her brand-new textbook. The smell of fresh paper hit her, and there it was, stamped in bold black ink on the first page. For those who believe that dignity can change the world. She read it once, then again, slowly. She didn't fully know what dignity meant, but somehow she felt it. It was the difference between being helped and being valued, between getting something and mattering. And in that exact moment, with a broken pencil and shaky fingers, she began to write not the assignment, but the story she was meant to tell. Back in Washington, Jasmine sat alone backstage after the interview. Her head was bowed, hands resting on her lap. Her team had left. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant pulse of a city that still didn't quite know what to make of her. On the table beside her was a small carved replica of the Tano sculpture. It had arrived in the mail, anonymously, no return address. Just a sticky note. You gave us permission to believe. Jasmine picked it up, turned it in her hands. She didn't cry. She didn't speak, but something inside her settled, like the sound of something finally, deeply understood. The next day, at a newly opened public library in Baltimore, a mural was unveiled. It spanned the entire back wall, two figures, one large and one small, hands joined, not standing over the world, but existing within it. Around them, trees rose from the earth, and books were scattered like seeds. Painted boldly across the top were the words, "Kindness unites worlds." No signatures, no politics, just the message. And every child who saw it understood this wasn't about governments. It was about them, and so the story didn't end. It didn't close with a vote or a treaty. It began again quietly, persistently, in classroom chalkboard lessons, in poems shared on street corners, in the moment a child realizes their voice matters. No matter how small it seems, Jasmine Crockett spoke one sentence and it cracked. Something open in the world. From Washington to Ouagadougou, from Tano's carved hands to Adama's scribbled dreams, that crack widened into a doorway. And through it, the future began to walk in one voice at a time. The video concluded. Applause filled the plaza. But what followed wasn't celebration, it was silence. Not the silence of confusion or fear, but one that was full intentional. A silence that held the weight of generations. Something had shifted in Washington, in Ouagadougou, in schoolyards and government chambers, in refugee shelters and academic circles. This shift didn't come from passing legislation or approving budgets. It came because, for the first time in a long while, someone spoke the truth aloud and dared to believe that dignity, not dominance, could reshape the world. Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to win popularity. She didn't speak to win favor or appease institutions. She understood the price of her words. She stepped into a political storm with nothing but her belief in what was right. And when she said, "Africa doesn't need saving, it needs to be heard," it wasn't a slogan, it was a revelation. A direct challenge to every system that had built itself on condescension, on assuming to know what people need, without ever listening to what they want. That sentence struck deeper than any policy. It disrupted, it unsettled. Because it wasn't just about foreign aid, it pointed to a larger, global problem. The routine silencing of those who've endured the most, who've had to be the strongest just to survive. And she said it clearly. No shouting, no grand gestures. Just truth and the courage to speak it. In the days that followed, she faced criticism. She was attacked, labeled reckless, radical, even unpatriotic. A senator said she embarrassed the nation. A TV host accused her of pushing anti-Western narratives. A commentator claimed she cared more for Burkina Faso than for Baltimore, but they missed the point. She wasn't speaking for another nation, she was speaking for a different future. And that future had already begun. It began when Tano gave President Traoré a wooden sculpture he'd carved with his own small hands, two figures, hand in hand, one large and one small. Beneath them, 5 words. Kindness unites worlds. In that single, handmade gift, not created through power but through innocence, the world saw something no government document could ever express. The humanity beneath politics. The simple beauty of being seen. And suddenly what Jasmine said didn't seem radical anymore. It felt necessary. It felt long overdue. Across Africa, the phrase began appearing on murals, chalkboards, signs at youth rallies. In America, it surfaced on protest. Placards and spoken word performances in church pulpits. Kindness unites worlds was no longer just a phrase. It became a guiding light. In Oakland, a high school debate team began their final round with Jasmine's powerful speech. Thousands of miles away in Nairobi, a young girl had written an essay titled, "What Would Happen If We Listened?" In a remote classroom, a teacher gathered students under a mango tree and played the speech on an old phone. When it ended, silence hung in the air. Then a child finally asked, "Why did it take so long?" That's the question we must all face. Why did it take so long for dignity to become a matter of policy? Why did it take us so long to recognize that real leadership is about service, not control? Why did it require one standing alone, fully aware of the consequences, to remind us that listening isn't weakness, it's a form of resistance? And maybe most strikingly, why did it take a small boy holding a block of wood to show a president what true legacy means? Jasmine wasn't asking for praise. She was calling for responsibility. She urged all leaders to choose courage over comfort. Not with grand gestures, but through honest actions, understanding that to serve people means to actually serve them. That listening to a village holds more power than trying to dominate a nation, and that a girl in a modest classroom deserves as much respect as a banker in a high-rise. That empathy, not ego, is what binds societies together. In Burkina Faso, President Traoré returned to his study. No cameras, no speeches, just him and a sculpture on his desk. He ran his fingers over the carved words, not as a president, but as a man who had made mistakes, chosen difficult paths, and given up comfort for change that doesn't make headlines. Looking out over his country, modest in wealth but rich in spirit, he whispered to no one, "We did it." And he was right. Not because everything was suddenly different, but because someone had finally said what needed to be said, and someone else had truly listened. That's how real change begins. It doesn't announce itself with noise or applause. It begins quietly. A sentence spoken with courage, in a tear shed silently, in a small statue given to a man who didn't expect to be moved. And most importantly, it starts with a belief, however faint, that the future can be different if we choose to listen to each other. So, what's the takeaway? When dignity stops being an afterthought, when we protect it, prioritize it. In the end, history doesn't remember the loudest voices. It remembers those who spoke the hardest truths and paid the price. Jasmine Crockett did, so did Ibrahim Traoré. And now it's our turn. If history begins in silence, then what comes next depends entirely on how we respond to it. This story doesn't end with applause. It doesn't stop with words etched in wood. It only continues if we choose to carry it forward, if we turn belief into action and purpose into momentum. This is the moment to decide, not tomorrow, not during the next election, not when it's convenient, now, because injustice survives in delay, because dignity fades in silence, because every time we assume someone else will speak, we empower those who've built empires on silence. Jasmine Crockett didn't wait for approval. Ibrahim Traoré didn't wait for recognition. And the children of Burkina Faso didn't wait for hope to be handed to them, they created it. So ask yourself, what are you waiting for? If you believe that leadership means service, stand. If you believe that people deserve to be heard, not managed, speak up. And if you've ever felt your voice was too small, remember this story. One voice in Washington shook continents. One moment of listening changed a country. One child's courage moved a president. Now it's your turn. Share this story. Start conversations. Question the narratives that reduce entire nations to pity and leaders to puppets. Write, march, teach, vote, donate, protest, defend. Refuse to stay silent when it matters most. Refuse to forget. Just because the headlines have moved on, because the world doesn't change when we watch, it changes when we act. And sometimes all it takes is one person in the right moment, speaking the truth in a room that's not ready to hear it. Be that person. Before the silence returns. Thank you for watching and standing with us on this path toward justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated. And please, share your thoughts below. Let us know which part of this story moved you most. Together, our voices can make a difference.